better used to these technology, but unfortunately not. So good morning for those of you who are more in the Western hemisphere. Good afternoon in the middle. Anyways, hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. And so today I will have the pleasure of talking about acculturation and the importance of methods and contexts. So first, let me introduce Samira. She is a woman who immigrated from Morocco to Canada a few years ago. She's very happy in general. Her children are doing well in school. She found a good job that's with a good salary. And she likes Canada. She's keen on adopting the new customs, new ways of doing, and so on. So she immigrated with her family, and her husband, unfortunately, is having a harder time. He is suffering a lot of discrimination, which is affecting her as well. And in terms of work, he's having a hard time finding a good job. And so Samira is often in the position to be the provider for the family, and that kind of clashes with the way they were handling their family in their country of origin. And so it's creating conflicts as well. And so Samira also has a very good friend from Colombia and another Vietnamese colleague with whom she spends a lot of time. And when she's with them, she's really, she's happy and she feels pretty Canadian, part of this kind of multicultural city in Montreal and so on. However, when she's back home or with other Moroccan friends, it's a little bit harder to bring forward that identity. So that's, in a nutshell, the story of Samira. And if Samira was part of a study on acculturation, traditionally, one would look at the extent to which she maintained her heritage Moroccan culture, and that would be her heritage acculturation. And one would also look at the extent to which she is adopting the mainstream culture, and that would be her mainstream acculturation. Many studies have shown that for immigrants like Samira, who do both, have mainstream acculturation and heritage acculturation, well, they're just better off in terms of psychological adjustment. All well and good, but I hope you would agree that this is not really doing justice to the story of Samira. The complexity of how she is negotiating her cultural identities and influences are way more complex than what this is showing. So really the point I want to make, 2 points actually I want to make today, is A, that context matters, in the sense that Samira is really embedded in different layers of context. And by any means, I'm not the only one making that case, and others like Colleen Ward and Nicholas Guéret have also made that point. And so it's really important to take that into account. The second point is that acculturation is not static. It's not a one-size-fits-all, in the sense that people are much more nuanced, and they will fluctuate, shift, depending on where they're at, with whom they are, and so on and so forth. And so really, I want to consider these 2 points today and make the argument that, well, if you want to really take that seriously, you need to move a bit beyond just a traditional self-report questionnaire, and rather consider acculturation methods as a toolbox. So have other ways of looking at acculturation and measuring these various aspects that I mentioned. So what I want to do for the rest of this presentation is to talk about 2 different studies that really try to get at these 2 points, the context and the dynamic aspects. First, let's talk about context. What do I mean by that? As I mentioned briefly, people are embedded in layers of context, and that goes from very micro-level social context, such as the couple or the family within which they are, and then within certain social relationships and the social network. But they're also embedded in particular neighborhoods and cities and regions and countries, and they are in certain workplaces and so on and so forth. And the point I would like to make here is that psychological adjustment is not really just the outcome of a person's personal acculturation, but more the outcome of an ongoing negotiation between the person herself and things that go on in the context within which she is embedded. So if we think about a migrant psychological adjustment, the person herself, yes, there is her acculturation. And one could say that acculturation, it really reflects a form of agentivity in cultural tasks. So her preferences, her desires, her motivation, the things that she wants to do, the things that she does. And in terms of context, it's really a multi-level context, as I said, going from very micro, like the couple, to very macro, like the country within which a person might choose to immigrate. And one can think of this context in terms of affordances and constraints. So what do I mean by affordances? If you look at these two pictures, two different areas, you can walk in both. You definitely can. However, I think we would all agree that the context on the right is much more suitable, much more amenable, much more affording walking than the one on the left. So yes, you can walk on the left, but it's going to be at a much greater cost than on the right, where the environment is naturally supporting your decision to walk. And that is this notion of affordances, the extent to which a context or a situation is really kind of scaffolding you into doing something that you want to do. So in this first study, it's a study that was conducted with my former student, Mélisse Rapaport, and my colleague, 𝙘𝙤𝙤𝙪𝙗𝙪𝙧𝙤𝙪. And the premise of this study was that although more than 50% of immigration takes place as a couple or a family unit, people are typically looking at individuals on their own. However, when you migrate as a couple or as a family unit, there's a key role of this dyadic context. You don't do things just on your own. There's a negotiation that's going on. And also this idea of the couple as the most proximal social context, I think is an important one to study. So there has been a little bit of work on migrating couples, not that much, to be honest. And there's usually that idea of acculturation gaps. So what does that mean? It means that in situations like the top one here, where both partners have different acculturation trajectories, for example, Samira really fitting in Canada and her husband really wanting none of it, well, typically this gap is associated with more difficulties. And in contrast, when both partners have the same kind of stance, so both Samira and her partner fully embracing this kind of Canadian way of life, well, that is typically associated with fewer difficulties, which is all nice and well, except that this work typically ignores the fact that couples themselves are embedded in other social contexts. And so one really needs to take that into account. So in this study, we wanted to take into account the partner context, the couple context, as well as the social network of the person, as well as the neighborhood within which this couple is living. So we recruited short of 200 couples, the majority of whom were born in France, and they had lived in Quebec for not very long, so fairly early in their acculturation journey. Our dependent variable, what we wanted to look at, in keeping with a lot of acculturation research, we looked at psychological distress as a kind of indicator of psychological adjustment. Our predictors, as mentioned earlier, we had several of them. First, we had kind of an acculturation, a typical acculturation scale with mainstream acculturation, so to what extent do I embrace the mainstream culture, and a heritage acculturation scale, so to what extent do I maintain my heritage culture. In terms of egocentric social network, some of you might not be familiar with this method, so let me walk you through it. In the first step, we ask people to do what we call name elicitation. So for example, we might ask Samira, well, who are the people you enjoy socializing with? And she might start listing some of her friends. Who are the people with whom you would be discussing important matters? And she's going to add more friends to that list. And finally, who are the people who played an important role in your adaptation? And she filled out more people in that list. In the second step, we asked her, well, among all these people you listed, please pick the 9 most relevant in your life. So she ends up with what we call alters, so basically 10 contacts in her network, the partner and 9 others. Then we have a step called alter interpretation, where we asked Samira to tell us for each and every one of her friends, what is their cultural background, Canadian, Québécois, their heritage culture, or some other immigrant or minority, how close she is to every one of her friends, from not at all close to extremely close. And in a final step, we ask her to, for every pair of contacts in her network, to tell us how well they know each other, from not at all. So my friend Samir and my friend Mary, they know each other not at all or extremely well. And so with all of this information, we can get a picture of her social network. Now, what do we extract from as measures, as indicators from that network? First, we looked at partner centrality. So her partner here, and the question is, well, how central is that person in her network? So we did what we call degree, which is simply counting how many of her friends does her partner know. And here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So in this particular illustration, the partner would have a degree of 7. He or she knows 7 persons. Then we also looked at cross-cultural ties, and that is a measure of kind of intercultural integration in that network. So cross-cultural ties, are connections between friends who are from different cultural backgrounds. For example, here we have a link between a mainstream person and a person of the heritage culture. And here would be another cross-cultural tie, whereas this one here is not. And so here we looked at the proportion of all the ties that exist in this network. What proportion are cross-cultural? And it can go from 0 to 1. Finally, we looked at emotional closeness. So we asked her, okay, all of your mainstream friends here, on average, how close are you to them? How close are you to those? And how close are you to your heritage friends? And finally, we looked at it at the level of the neighborhood, the perceived density of the mainstream culture. So essentially, we're asking participants, to what extent are you living in a very white Québécois Francophone neighborhood? That's a high mainstream density versus a more multicultural neighborhood where there might not be a dominant kind of cultural group. So what did we do to predict psychological adjustment? We used multi-level regressions with an actor-partner interdependence model, meaning that we're looking at what we call actor effect, which is Samira's own characteristics. So Samira's own acculturation. How much is that influencing her psychological distress? Then we have a partner effect, is Samira's partner. How much is his scores on acculturation influencing Samira's distress? Pardon me. And we looked at acculturation gaps. So is there a congruence or a gap between them? And beyond these kind of individual and couple effects, we also look at the characteristics of the social network that I mentioned and the density of the neighborhood. So what we were really interested in there is with this idea that it's a negotiation with their environment and that people do this kind of interplay of network and other contextual characteristics. We were mostly interested in interactions. Because indeed, in terms of main effects, well, there were none. So on their own, none of these characteristics were directly associated with psychological distress. However, would we conclude that there's no effects? No, actually, because there were several interaction effects that are, I think, quite interesting. So what I'll do is I will illustrate 4 interaction effects that we found. And what they do is that they illustrate 4 different ways in which this kind of ongoing negotiation between the person and the context can have an impact on psychological distress. So first, let's look at the interaction between mainstream network closeness and heritage acculturation. So to what extent is Samira close to her Quebecois friends with, well, how much she rated that she's maintaining her heritage Moroccan culture? So what do we find here? We find that when she's not very close to her mainstream Quebecois friends, it doesn't really matter whether she is really keen on preserving Moroccan culture or not. It's fairly unrelated to psychological distress. However, when she is close to her Quebecois friends, so presumably these Quebecois friends have an important role in her life, well, then the more she tends to really maintain the Moroccan culture, the more distressing that's going to be. Pardon me. Why might that be? Well, it's because there might be an incongruence with her really keen on maintaining the Moroccan culture and at the same time being very close to her mainstream friends. So what it's showing here is that the person's own choices, her own agentivity, isn't sufficient to understand her distress or lack of distress. She's really embedded in that social structure. And there is this notion of person context fit. I'm sorry, I'm recovering from being sick, and it's really showing. So person context fit, and that's related to adjustment. And this is nothing new. We find that in other literatures, like in the organizational literature and so on. When the person's own goals and values and the things they try to do fits well with the context, that tends to be associated with better adjustment. So that's kind of one way in which we have this negotiation. The second way, now looking at the partner, so we're going to look at to what extent is Samira satisfied with her relationship? How well is it going with her husband? And then how central is the partner in her network? Is it a very central person where the partner knows all of her friends and so on, or not? Maybe he's a more marginal place in her network, and her mainstream acculturation. So what do we find here? What we find is that when things are going well with her husband, really it's satisfied with the relationship, well then it doesn't matter whether the partner is very central in her network or not centered and not central in her network. Well, and whether she embraces the culture, Quebecois culture, highly or not, this is it's a null effect here. It's unrelated to psychological distress and with a kind of lowish level of distress. In contrast, for one thing, when she has low satisfaction with her partner, so things are not going very well in her couple, well, there is more distress in general, as one would expect. Second, what's really interesting is that when she is not very satisfied with her husband, but he's not very central in her network, well, there is high distress, but it's unrelated to the extent to which she is endorsing the mainstream culture or not. The interesting line here is this kind of mainstream acculturation, showing that when things are not going well with her husband, but he's very central in her network, he knows all of her friends and so on and so forth, well, in this particular case, the more she's trying to adopt a mainstream culture, the more distress she's going to feel. So how do we make sense of that? Well, for one thing, acculturation is costly. It's difficult to learn new ways of talking, new ways of doing things, adopting new values, adopting new new emotional patterns, and so on and so forth. It is costly. It's difficult. So you really need a social context that will be supportive, that will afford that. And in this particular case, what's really distressing is when there's a clash between how she feels, how she perceives her partner, the satisfaction, versus his social position, where he is in her network. And so when there's a clash between these two things, this is where you have the most distress. Whereas when things are incongruence one way or another, that's actually less distress. So really what we see here is that not only do you need to have a fit with your environment, but mostly the different bits and pieces of your environment also need to fit with one another in order to be affording and supporting you. So here, if you have this contextual congruence, then it's going to support you realizing costly, difficult tasks, cultural tasks, but with less adjustment impact. Okay, the third way to look at it here is looking at cross-cultural ties and heritage acculturation gap. Okay, so what do we have here? First, these two lines here are situations where there's no gap between the partners. So here on the left, Samira doesn't really care about maintaining Moroccan culture, and neither does her husband. On the right, both of them are very keen on maintaining their Moroccan culture. But in any case, there's no gap. What we find is that in both of these situations, the more intercultural ties there are in her network, the less psychological distress there's going to be, because these cross-cultural ties are going to be acting as a bridge between her different cultures. In contrast, in these two situations here, there's a gap. Here, her partner doesn't want anything with Moroccan culture, but she does, and vice versa here. And in this case, we find that actually, the more intercultural gaps there are in her network, the more distress there's going to be. So how do we make sense of that? So cross-cultural ties, it's a mixed result thing, and it's not the first time that it's showing up. Sometimes it's beneficial, sometimes it's onerous. They're difficult. Imagine you're sitting at a dinner table with your Moroccan friend and your Quebecois friend, and there might be clashes in ways of doing things and expectations and so on. So they are, in any case, demanding ties. So they really require these contextual affordances. And in kind of stress coping frameworks, we have this idea that when the demands exceed the resources, it results in ill-being. One we could say that the cultural demands exceed the contextual affordances. Well, that's also going to result in ill-being. And final result here for the study is looking at, again, these cross-cultural ties, but this time looking in the interaction with social support and the neighborhood mainstream density. So what we have here on the left is a panel where it's a low mainstream density. So it's not a very white Quebecois Francophone neighborhood, most likely more multicultural. In this particular case, we see the main effect of social support. Well, obviously, if you have lower social support, you're going to feel more distress than if you have a lot of it. But these lines are fairly flat. The cross-cultural ties in her network don't seem to do much of anything. In contrast, when Samira lives in a very mainstream density neighborhood with a lot of white Francophone Quebecois, well, then it really depends. But this is a more difficult neighborhood to live in because she's going to stand out. It's going to be harder to make ties and so on and so forth. So what we see is that in this particular case, if she has low social support, we see again that the more cross-cultural ties, the more distress. So these difficult, demanding ties become more of a liability in cases of low social support in this demanding neighborhood. Whereas if she has high social support, well, actually, having these cross-cultural ties, they're going to act as bridges between her different cultural streams, that's going to be helpful. And having more of them will be decreasing her psychological distress. This is this line here. Oh yeah, sorry. And then I already talked about that. So what do we find here? There's this notion of embedded context. So yes, she is embedded in the social, Samira is embedded in a social network, but that social network, it's also embedded in a kind of geographical location that has certain characteristics, really going from proximal social context to a more distal one. And you have an interplay between these different levels, and depending on the interplay, it will have some affordances or some constraints. Living in a high mainstream density neighborhood is difficult. You have typically greater isolation. And so these cross-cultural ties, they're kind of high risk, high reward. If they go well, it's really rewarding. But if not, they're really a liability. So they require greater contextual affordances. So this is basically the takeaway from that. So to sum up, I wanted to show you these different ways in which context is going to be interacting to influence psychological distress through 4 mechanisms that I illustrated. So now I want to turn to a second study that's illustrating the more dynamic process, how acculturation is dynamic. So if I go back, typically what you would see in terms of this time turning to the more identity domain, cultural identity, you would find that people who have a higher mainstream identity, so identify as Canadian, or have a greater identity integration, they're going to be reporting more psychological adjustment. Well, that's a typical thing. Except that if you think about Samira, she actually feels quite differently, depending on whether she's having coffee with friends, at home with her family, maybe in a location of a church, like a cult or a prayer location, or at work. And so research has shown that people really shift back and forth. She might be feeling very Canadian in some moments, very Moroccan in others, and kind of a hybrid in some other cases. And so one important question here is, well, how do we, this is fine and well, we know that people shift. But is there something interesting to know about the extent to which they shift? So how do we measure variability here? And that's where I want to introduce the concept of entropy. So entropy is a concept that originated in thermodynamics to quantify the extent to which a system has high order, things are ordered and stable, like on the left, or more chaotic, unpredictable disorder. And this has been adapted in information theory by Shannon. And essentially, for our purposes in social sciences, entropy is an index of our ability to predict the next state of the system. So, and our predictions are based on the perceptual frames that we're going to apply. I'm going to clarify that. So back to Samira now. We know that cultural identity is a very important cultural frame. If I strongly endorse a Moroccan identity in the moment, well, chances are this is going to influence how I'm going to act, how I'm going to respond, how I'm going to feel, and so on. So let's take 2 cases. Amira has 4 cultural identities that she could endorse or fluctuate between. She has a Canadian identity, Moroccan Canadian. This is a hybrid that's considered separate from the other 2, and maybe a Muslim identity as well. So consider a situation where Amira is in some interaction with people and she feels very strongly Moroccan, and she's not really at all feeling like the other cultural identities. Well, in such a moment, it's kind of easy to predict what's going to be next in the system. She's going to be applying a Moroccan frame, a perspective to make sense of the interaction. That's going to influence her response, the way she's going to feel, and so on and so forth. So it's a very predictable next state. And so it would be a case of low entropy. In contrast, picture a situation where she is really feeling a mix of identities in the situation. There is some Arab Canadian, there is some Canadian, there is Moroccan, there is Muslim, and it's fairly balanced. While in such a situation, it's kind of hard to predict what perceptual frame is she going to apply for the next thing she's going to do, how she's going to feel, how she's going to react, because it could be any of these cultural lenses or any combination thereof. So it's difficult to predict, and that would be a high entropy state. So if you look at these two slides, what follows is that greater cultural identity entropy is reflective of a greater balance in one's cultural identities, and therefore a greater flexibility in the kind of cultural frames, cultural perspectives that one could be using in a situation. And so our hypothesis was that greater entropy should probably be associated with greater adjustment. So in this study, what we wanted to do is, well, see, indeed, if I compare cultural identity entropy against the traditional general identity measures, what do we get? Do they account for additional variance? Do they tell us something above and beyond? So that's a study that we conducted with 3 of my graduate students, Leah, Sarah, and Anna. We recruited participants from the Maghreb, so Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. 93 of them, they had been in Quebec for slightly longer. And what we did is that we had 2 components for the study. One, a baseline, where they came in the lab and they filled out a battery of self-report questionnaire, and then diaries at home. So they went back home, and every day for 7 days, and in the evening, they filled out questions about their day, and then they mailed us the whole thing. So here, what we're trying to predict, to account for, our dependent variable, is psychological adjustment, fairly typical scale. What did we use to predict? Well, we had a bunch of predictors that are these kind of baseline general questionnaires, the traditional measures, where we had the strength of identification with the mainstream culture and their heritage culture. And that's kind of the circle measure. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, where you indicate to what extent yourself is really merged, overlapping with the cultural group in question. We had the very popular bicultural identity integration with a blendedness subscale. To what extent can I kind of mix my cultures? And the harmony subscale. To what extent do they clash, conflict, or are harmonious together? Pardon me. And then we had the multicultural identity integration scale with the compartmentalization subscale. So to what extent do I really need to keep my cultures in a separate compartment versus the integration subscale? To what extent do they kind of mix together as one whole thing? So that's for the baseline, more traditional self-report questionnaires. And then, as I said, people went home, and for 7 days, they answered questions about the 5 most important interactions they had on that day. And for each interaction, they told us with whom they were interacting. So was it a Canadian Québécois, Maghrebi, or some other immigrant minority interlocutor? Then they told us, to what extent do you feel Moroccan, Algerian, Tunisian in that moment? How strong was that identity in that moment? How strong was the Canadian identity? And, well, how pleasant was the interaction? What we did then, so we had a set of 35 interactions for over 7 days. And we extracted from all these interactions an average entropy, so the average kind of balance flexibility in heritage context, in mainstream context, and in third culture context. So meaning in situations where they were talking with a Maghrebi interlocutor, situations where they were talking with a Québécois Canadian interlocutor, and in situations where she was, for example, talking with her Vietnamese friend. And this is the formula to compute entropy. So then we just did simple multiple regressions where we had these three traditional self-report cultural identity questionnaires. And then in the final step, the entropy that we derived from the daily diaries. And we looked at all four of them in the prediction of psychological adjustment. What did we find? Well, first we found that these three together accounted for 29% of variance in psychological adjustment. So that's a third of the variability, roughly, was accounted for these. And what was really interesting is that when we added the entropy from this kind of daily interactions, or R squared jumped to 0.5, so which is substantial as additional explained variance, almost 0.21. So that was already encouraging and support of our hypothesis that, well, yeah, you really need to look at daily interactions. These kind of general self-report questionnaires are not sufficient to understand the extent to which a person will be psychologically happy or more unhappy. And then when we put all these predictors together, what really stood out is that, well, if you put them all, you really have only two of them that stick out as significant predictors. So the others disappeared. So it was just the harmony subscale of the BII, which was a kind of fairly strong predictor of psychological adjustment. And then we have entropy, so flexibility, balance, and heritage context, that was an even stronger predictor of psychological adjustment. And when we did a test, we saw that actually, indeed, this one was significantly stronger than this one. So what does that mean, that higher entropy in heritage context is associated with greater psychological adjustment? Well, if you think about it, if you are an immigrant and you are in people of the same cultural background, it can be tricky at times because the heritage culture social ties can be a bit of a double-edged sword in the sense that they provide emotional support and a sense of security and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they can have higher expectations. There are more demands made on you, typically, from people from the same cultures than other cultures. So in such a situation, it might be helpful to have a more flexible repertoire of ways of handling cultural demands. Another possibility to explain that is that, well, typically people remain high in how much they identify with their culture of origin. So having more balance means that you're gradually bringing into heritage context your identification with the mainstream. So you're kind of gradually having a more balanced way of being that reflects the multiple cultural influences that are merging into the self. One important point, I think, from these results is that we tend oftentimes to consider or to see variability as noise, as something that ideally you would get rid of because you would want to have a pure measure. But it's much more rare that we consider variability as information, as a source of that data on its own right that could tell us something about people's adjustment. And I think that's what entropy is showing here, is that this variability in moment to moment, the extent to which people have that, well, that is actually an important source of information if you want to understand people's psychological adjustment. So if I now turn to a more general discussion, bringing together these various results, typically in acculturation, Samira would be considered a bit like a person in a vacuum. It's about what she decides, what her preferences are, and so on and so forth, and her adjustments, but completely disregarding the fact that Samira is actually embedded in a very rich and complex social environment with different relationships, with different sources of influences that all really need to be taken into account if you want to do justice to her experience, and really if you want to understand her adjustment better. So what we need to have is really a more holistic view of the person in these kind of acculturation processes. And to do that, we need to rely on a toolbox. The methods are really important because you're not going to be able to capture everything with the standard self-report scales. We need to look at their social networks. We need to look at their daily interactions. We need to look at dyadic data. And here I gave you an example with a couple, but of course that extends to family unit or even close friends that would be playing an important role. So all of these interpersonal nuances are also important. And finally, here we used a bit of a proxy for the mainstream density, like self-reported. To what extent do you think your neighborhood is very diverse or not? But it's actually fairly easy when you ask somebody's postal code to then link that with census data that would have very precise information about different characteristics of the neighborhood within which people live, work, and so on. And so finally, as a take-home message, what I really want to leave you with is this idea that if you take this holistic view of the person embedded in this web of contexts and cultural influences, well, it really becomes a dynamic system. And it's really through this interplay between a person's own agentivity, the affordances of the context, and the flexibility in managing these different things. It's really taking all of that into account that we're going to be seeing adjustment as kind of an emerging property of this whole messy, complex system. And on that note, I want to thank you for your attention. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the funding agencies that have made that work possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate your thoughtful speech. And we have gained important insight, and you helped us see a fresh perspective on acculturation. Since we have many participants today, to save the time, without further ado, let's open the floor for questions and discussion. It would be great to hear everyone's thoughts and experiences on this topic. Those who have a question, please raise your hand or type your question in the chat box.
Excuse me, I have a question. I have to.
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Marina, thank you for this presentation. It's an excellent presentation. And actually, it touched our experiences where I have to deal with such a problem before, or maybe on recurrent basis through dealing with different types of people, rolling in different multicultural environments. When I exposed to these situations, I had to open my mind and think out of the box and read a lot and look to different situations around and interact with different cultures from over around, so I can deal with this psychoanalysis of the deep personalities of people, where to interact with the different persons around in workplaces, in relations, in humanities, in different sectors. When I was young, in my early experience, I was not knowing how to deal and interact with such personalities. And I'm a fond of psychologists, by the way. So I had to read so many books around in sociology and in this field. And I had to interact with different people, open my mind to different cultures, and listen to masters like you. So it really touched my experience a lot. Thank you for your presentation. It's an excellent, definitely one. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, someone has a question, I think.
Hi, yes, actually, I have a question. Thank you so much for the insights and the wonderful presentation. I found it quite enlightening. I just wanted to ask a question in terms of sort of like the stress the trigger stress and anxiety that comes with acculturation. Are there any long-term studies in terms of mitigating the damages, or is it just solely based on the person and the studies have not sort of been completed yet?
Long-term studies, not that I'm aware, in the sense that even when there are longitudinal studies in acculturation, they tend to be fairly brief. So we don't have kind of a lifelong perspective on the topic. And in terms of mitigating it, well, it depends a lot on the stressors. Sometimes, for example, stressors will be discrimination. I alluded to it in my story of Samira's husband. So that's going to be an important stressors. And yes, there are things that can mitigate the stressors. Oftentimes it will be social support, things where the person finds a group of people who are really helping them be well and safe. We also did some work showing that some physiological aspects are mitigating the negative impact of discrimination stress on people's acculturation. But I would say that's a very broad topic with many different facets that could be potential answers to that question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your feedback. Much appreciated.
I was okay. Got a question. I don't know if I have to wait to be chosen to raise the question, but okay, here I am already speaking. Okay, first of all, I want to thank you so much for the presentation. It was really amazing. I'm really impressed for the seminar, and I really want to thank for this opportunity to be here in this seminar. It has to do with acculturation. Actually, myself as a teacher, I'm inserted in something, I'm inserted in a place that I think it has been affecting the students. So acculturation has got an psychological impact indeed, as you brought there the analysis and the discussion of those students and that person who had to go through acculturation. So what role can teachers play in maybe minimizing the psychological impact that acculturation has to students? Because actually when someone is inserted in a different environment, it can really affect psychologically the student, mainly students who have to study in different places or districts, provinces, or even countries. Then at some point that can impact them at some point. So what role can the teacher play in order to help minimize or even tackle this issue of acculturation that has got an impact in psychological sense?
Yeah, well, thank you for this really good question. I think this could be a seminar on its own. I think there are a few elements of response. One is to think about the ways in which the curriculum, the ways of teaching, and so on are very reflective of a particular cultural way of doing things. And so being aware of noticing that and making space to bring in different perspectives. And so that can also be when a student is struggling or doing things that seem a bit offbeat or strange, to actually account for the fact that it might just be a perfectly valid way, different cultural way of doing things, and maybe inquire about that. A second one I would say is to really sensitize the students in general to the topics of cultural differences, of discrimination and microaggressions and so on. Because oftentimes what happens is that even if people are meaning well, they can act in a way or ask questions or that might be difficult for the people who are not from this particular cultural environment. I think that's a second way. And sometimes it's just about also giving space for people to talk about their stories and so on. Um, in my experience in teaching students, I've been quite surprised by how much my more like mainstream students had very little contact with immigrants, with people from cultural minorities. And so any activities that would, depending on what you teach, obviously, but having activities that would kind of put into contact the students from the mainstream with immigrants. Sometimes you can have these kind of buddy or pairing systems in schools or in universities that can be very beneficial for them to just have a bit of an idea of how difficult this this journey of immigrating can be. At least in my experience, I've had students say, gee, that completely opened my eyes. I had never really thought about what it's like to arrive in a place where you don't speak the language, you don't know anyone, and you have to rebuild from scratch. I feel I'm not doing justice to your question, but I feel that that could be a very long conversation as well.
Thank you. That was clear.
Thank you. And I think another person, her name is, if I'm pronouncing correctly, Tobil has a question.
Thank you, Ali. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Marina, for the great presentation.
Thank you.
You know, you just highlighted or enlightened us on things that we took for granted. Because sometimes, you know, we thought that maybe people are being stereotypical because to take like they have stereotypes with what they know and having resistance to assimilating or, you know, adopting cultures of other, maybe of other natives. But the way we have explained it, we've always taken it for granted. I, for one, we never thought that maybe this is a matter that I really deserved some scientific, whether it be psychological or social scientific attention. But I think you should just go into more of the chapters or issues in the future so that there's other dynamics that surround the issues around acculturation, because it helps. I might be a person who adjusts in other cultures, but it's also reflects or impacts on me if I live around people who don't want to acculturate, if I can, for the lack of a different word. But
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think that's a very important point. And if I may just add, is that I find very unfortunate in general policies and programs, or the more even the kind of debates in the public space, they imply or they put the onus on the person who is immigrating. And if they don't adopt the new culture and so on, it's probably their fault, or it's probably because they're not motivated. And I think this is such a simplistic and short-sighted view that is totally wrong, actually. And I think that's there's much more to the story, and depending where they're at, what's the context, and so on. And I think that's a damaging kind of discourse that that is way too prevalent, in my opinion.
Thank you. And I think the last question, we don't have, you know, lots of time. So the last question is for Eunith. I don't know if he has a question. Or Chris.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Doctor. My name is Chris Malunga. I think there's a previous colleague has just touched on what I wanted to ask about, but it is in terms of the, you know, when studying at a university or at a school, I wanted to find out, you know, the impact that it has on the male and the female. I don't know your studies. How do you go about when it comes to the male and the female? What are the impacts in terms of the male and the female?
You mean like the differences between more men and women immigrating students?
Yes. Yes.
It depends. It really depends, actually. There isn't a single answer that I could give you. Because again, it depends on the context. So, for example, one thing I found in adult people immigrating, in couples again, there's a, men who have a harder time, and this is a generalization, again, it's really not about specifics, but when it's more difficult to get a footing and get a job and make money and so on, that tends to be harder on the men. And the women, in some cases, the immigration will give them different, because things are all in flux and need to be rebuilt again. So sometimes it will give them different roles or different ways of trying out things that they wouldn't have had a chance before. And sometimes it's actually the positive thing for them. So it really depends.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. I'm answered.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so the last thing is, those who wish to receive the certificate of attendance should send me an email after the session today, and we will send the certificate within 2 or 3 weeks of receiving the request. Please make sure to include your full name and the date of the session in your email for verification purposes. And if all agree, please turn your cameras on to have a picture for having a good memory of this session together.
Yeah.
1, 2, and 3. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We learned a lot today.
Thank you so much.
And it was
Thank
so
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.